Hi, today we're going to discuss Chapter 4 Becoming a Better Listener. Listening is the second part of communication, which, together with speech, makes for better communication. The middle part of that process is the actual message, and the message is studied in media communication. In the human communication, we look at the sender of the message and the receiver of the message. Since we're dealing with public speaking, we'll all find ourselves in the role of a listener and evaluator. And when our classmates, our peers, our teachers speak to us, we need to do the work of listening to make sense of the information. So I'm going to try and fit this in within the 15 minutes provided by YouTube. See how we depend on Silicon Valley? Okay, so effective listening. What are some of the benefits of good listening skills? It's good for a workplace. It allows you to avoid misunderstandings, allows for better performance, enhances your chances for advancement. And as a student, you will learn better. You will actually observe communication skills in action. You can study communication by studying listening and create a supportive environment for your own learning and the learning of others. I must say that when I was in high school, my mode of learning was through listening. I am a listener, and therefore I continued my work in audio, in radio, and everything I learned was not from reading, although I did read a lot of literature. My learning came from listening to my teachers very attentively, asking questions when important, when necessary and appropriate, and sometimes when it was inappropriate. So listening allows you to absorb a lot more than you can, because it is a more direct and effective way of sharing information. So there are different types of listening: discriminative listening, comprehensive listening, emphatic listening, appreciative listening, critical listening, and constructive listening. We can tell that all these types of listening are self-explanatory almost, except for discriminative. And I suggest that you read the definitions from our textbook, because I believe you do have it and it needs to serve some purpose. So this is me telling you to go into the chapter 4, and read some more about discriminative, comprehensive, emphatic, appreciative, critical, and constructive listening. I should say that discriminative listening, among other things, is also listening for certain things, like how to differentiate between things, how to understand something. Comprehensive, more broader. Emphatic is emotional appeal, uh, feeling for the other, understanding the other, showing empathy. Appreciative, of course, that's self-explanatory. Critical, also self-explanatory. And constructive, also in order to build something. Let's say your classmate is running some ideas by you, and you will help them improve those ideas. That will be constructive. If the classmate is asking for feedback, you might exercise critical listening. So my favorite part of this chapter is talking about the barriers to effective listening. And among those barriers are objective ones, that is the situation and speaker related. There is nothing you can do about the room in which you are, or the mode of listening in which you are. Let's say you're listening online through a channel that is not clean, and related to the listener, yourself. So what are some of the disturbances that we can have? Situations and speaker barriers can include noise, um, problems with the message. The message is not coherent itself, and the style of presentation. It may be jumbled, it may be unclear. Like, for example, if I'm speaking with you and stopping and making mistakes, that creates a barrier against listening. My own 2 cents, too boring. I fall asleep. I don't pay attention because it's like a lullaby. Remember the Lullaby Channel? Family Guy, I think it was Peter who drove under the Lullaby Channel and fell asleep. Or was it The Simpsons? Doesn't matter. Okay, barriers related to the listener. Inattention, lack of attention. As we said when we were talking about public speaking itself, the audience brings problems, concerns, feelings into the room from home, from their own lives. So lack of attention is not always an insult to the speaker. It may be a function of the listener's life. The style of your preferred style of listening may not be the way you're offered the information. Let's say if something comes through radio, maybe you would prefer hearing that firsthand from a real person. Bad habits of doodling or multitasking or checking your texts every second, not paying attention. I like to multitask, and when I'm in a Teams meeting, for example, with my colleagues, it has happened. I've done other things, such as checking my email. And then, of course, you miss something. And then whose fault it is that you haven't understood everything? Well, it's your own fault because you have a habit of multitasking, sneaking other activities into the process. Listening apprehension is when people hate listening to others. Communication apprehension, speaking apprehension, listening apprehension. There are people who hate to listen. They would bring up any kind of argument without hearing you out. Emotional reactions to words, if the speaker is not choosing the words carefully, insulting the listener or creating an impression that the speaker does not know much about the material, the language, the words, the jargon, and finally attitudes. And we can actually look at several of them separately and see what they do. So let's develop some critical listening skills among ourselves. Evaluating the evidence and information presented in the speech is one way of critical absorption of material. Evaluating, assessing the credibility of the sources. Where does the information come from? It's not enough to say, oh, there are papers. I read this in a paper, in a newspaper. I read the founding paper on this subject matter. Well, my question would be, how did you find it? I Googled it. Well, if you're Googling it, then you're relying on the algorithm of Google. So whatever Google tells you, you take that as absolutely credible. In the old days, there were encyclopedias, there were books. There is the Bible. But even that is written by somebody, by a hand. No matter who inspired, no matter what divinity inspired the writing, it is still put on paper by a human. So you need to be aware of the source, you need to be aware of the author's intentions, and evaluate, assess their credibility. Many times you'll find them reliable. Analyzing the use of language, how the speaker uses words, and examining the speaker's rhetorical choices. So the evidence of information, it should be relevant, representative, it should be fresh, and reliable. So those things you can study from the textbook, with examples and such, but these are clear. Facts, inferences, opinion also have a place in public speaking. You can speak with opinion, but it needs to be presented as such. If you're presenting your personal judgment, it should be put in the proper frame of, in my opinion, from what I've heard, from what I've analyzed, I conclude that this and this is true. Inferences, if you have incomplete data, if the speaker is presenting incomplete data, making inferences, those should be stated, those should be presented as such, those should be introduced as such, as inferences, as leaps of faith or judgment. And facts are, of course, variable information that can be verified through credible sources. So what is the credibility of a source? You need to bring up the source itself, determine the trustworthiness of the source, and see if the author or the authors, if the source has vested interest in presenting facts and information in a certain way. Consider their expertise, their training, their relevance to the topic. Let's say if someone is a medical doctor and talks about public health, that is relevant, but to what degree? And the use of language. Sometimes people use confusing language, it's jumbled, it's not clear. Sometimes people use vague words and jargon, scientific or pseudoscientific jargon. So either way, either it's scientific or pseudoscientific, you don't want jargon if you're speaking to a lay audience. However, if you're speaking to an audience of experts, let's say we've discussed certain things in chapters 1, 2, and 3. In chapter 4, I'm allowed to use terms such as communication apprehension because I know you will understand. So, rhetoric, the last part of examining the validity of a speech, the rhetorical strategies. Is there information to back up the speaker's emotional appeal? Is there a lack of emotion when appropriate? When the person is making logical statements, logical judgment, it needs to make sense and it needs to acknowledge, to be open to alternative views, because anything that is absolute dogmatic should not be presented as the absolute truth. So, red flags against critical listening. There is no objective evidence to the facts and statements. The sources of those facts or views are not identified, but brought up as general, general knowledge. If the sources are questionable or biased, if what you hear is inconsistent with what you know or what you believe in, if there are claims of exclusivity, the person says, I'm the only one who knows this and I'm going to share it with you, that is a red flag. I'm not saying it definitely means an error or a bad intention, but it does raise a flag. Opinions passed off as facts, faith in anything, beliefs passed on as facts. And I don't mean religious belief. I mean anything that you trust, you believe in, and present that as a dogma. Vague language, as we mentioned before, incomprehensible language that rely on jargon and specific words, terminology. Blatant emotional appeals, openly advertising, openly promoting, openly persuading people, and outlandish promises or guarantees. Those should be red flags that should tell you to stop and think about what you hear again, so that you're not trapped into something that is not absolutely reliable and verifiable. Okay, I will pause here and continue the rest of the chapter in another segment of my video. Stay tuned.